Chapter 3. Amalia sat in the corner of her holding cell, eyes trained on the grimy ground before her. In the opposite corner, on the other side of the bars, stood Judge Drace, a silent and imposing figure keeping watch over her at all hours. Vane had not spoken to the prisoner since first interviewing her upon her apprehension, at which point she had made several allegations regarding her origins that he could not possibly prove as true or false. He had his suspicions, of course, but he wouldn't dare make them known until he held certain evidence. He couldn't afford a single mistake with his father watching his every move. The city had calmed somewhat, but the disaster at the fete had done irreparable damage to his image, among other things, and nearly half of the resistance members that had been captured had disappeared only a few hours after their imprisonment. Though the escape had been successfully withheld from the public, and Amalia, word would no doubt spread quickly, and they would soon come after their comrades. Vane had already scheduled many of them for execution, but some could not be convicted under Dalmascan law due to lack of evidence that they had participated willingly, and, although he held the power and the position, he was in no place to go changing laws in order to kill what were viewed widely as loyal Dalmascans. He had to get these people to like him, after all. His nagging thoughts spurred him to pace in the hall outside of Amalia's cell, and he felt the beginnings of a migraine brewing behind his eyes, but knew he had no time for dealing with such trifles. With the 8th Fleet mere days away from arrival, his first priority was making the palace safe, and holding a leader of the resistance within its walls did not serve this purpose in the least. But still, he could not remove her until her background had been thoroughly investigated, and even then, where would he move her that the resistance could not infiltrate? As he paced, his personal bodyguard, Judge Bergen, approached carrying a letter, which he held out to the prince dutifully.
"Lord Vane, a message from Judge Gabranth." "A message?"
Vane asked irritably, taking the letter and opening it.
"He is unable to report to you personally,"
Bergen explained.
"The Emperor bade him come to Arcades before the 8th Fleet should arrive."
At this Vane rolled his eyes and released an ill-tempered sigh, behavior he would only allow himself in front of the ever-understanding and commiserating Bergen.
"How does the old bastard expect me to run anything efficiently when he is constantly ordering my men about on his own business?" "A good question, Highness, but one I'd rather not involve myself with."
Vane scanned over the letter, praying for confirmation, but finding no such thing. The Kingslayer, it seemed, gave but a minimal account of General Amalia, claiming no knowledge of her, though Gabranth felt sure that this was a lie and that the woman was indeed of great importance. Getting Bosch to cooperate was the only thing Gabranth was any good for those days. He'd lost his edge after the Nalbina incident, and Vane had wanted to silence him then, but Drace and Gramis found him to be a necessity, and so he stayed. Of greater note, however, was that Bosch had gone missing, as had the infamous Bolthir Bonanza, much to the detriment of Dr. Sid's bounty hunters. Vane withheld a groan, knowing what would have to be done about both quandaries, and looked up to Bergen.
"We're screwed,"
he said.
"My sympathies,"
the judge replied.
"Things were supposed to calm down after I left the ranks,"
Vane growled.
"If this nonsense keeps up, I'll have to send the 8th back." "Highness, you couldn't do that,"
Bergen insisted.
"It's been more than a month since you last saw each other. We'll step up the security." "No, we have to get rid of her." "Agreed. But His Excellency will not act so quickly." "He will not trust me so quickly, either,"
Vane all but groaned.
"With the Kingslayer on the loose, we stand to lose Bougerba." I could have him disposed of,
Bergen offered with considerable insolence.
No,
said Vane.
I've got bigger plans for you. I've changed my mind about the Bonanza kid, I want him killed.
At this, the judge paused and turned his head slightly, a motion that would have been far more exaggerated were he not so burdened beneath his helmet.
But Dr. Sid. I don't care,
Vane said with serpentine smoothness.
He knows too much. I can't risk him getting close to the insurgents. My lord, he would never allow such information to fall into the wrong hands. He's a loose cannon, Bergen. Maybe Sid can't understand that, but I can. See that it's done. Yes, my lord.
Vane raised the letter and headed toward the door of Amalia's cell.
Wish me luck.
Bergen nodded, and Vane stepped into the room with as dignified a manner as he could muster. In the far corner stood Drace, and in the opposite corner, on a bland bench fixed securely to the wall, sat the brooding Amalia, enclosed on the other side of a set of steel bars, but nonetheless possessed of an attitude of one who held ground in the same room as all others. He had to admit that she was the most beautiful general he'd ever seen, with warmly sun-kissed skin and pale almond hair that took on a silvery glint in the proper light, but his years of military service had bred in him the tendency to view women in two distinct categories, soldiers and civilians. He'd commanded female soldiers in battle, and knew that they could freeze their emotions far more effectively than men could. A woman with a sword, he had learned long ago, was rivaled by no other threat. But in Amalia he found something oddly feminine, something he had seen only in rebels. She had not been a soldier for long. He could almost feel it. She could give and take orders, she could hold her ground in combat, but she still bore the gentle countenance of a woman accustomed to chivalry, and for this her tales of years spent in the army simply did not wash. As he entered the holding quarters once more, he immediately recognized the nobility of her posture, the way her fingers laid so daintily parallel to each other in spite of their manly strength, the way her ankles crossed and her knees pressed together in spite of her clunky boots. Even as she rose upon his entry, her carriage betrayed her. A glass of water could be balanced on her head and barely wobble as she walked. He did not comment on such things, though, too well trained in Arcadian etiquette, and instead shut the door behind him, nodding his greeting to Drace, but not daring to ask for privacy. Drace was the only judge who could intimidate Vane, he hated it. As soon as he met eyes with Amalia, she took up their previous conversation.
I'm not lying. We'll see.
He folded the letter after taking one last glance down at it, then returned his gaze to her.
How old are you again, if you don't mind me prying? 32.
Looking her up and down, he withheld an almost cordial smile.
I hope you'll forgive me for being forward, but you look 10 years younger.
Thank you, she said cattily.
You spent 2 years serving under Captain Ronsenberg when Arcadia marched on the Republic of Landis, correct? Yes, but he was a lieutenant then. Right,
he continued, slowly pacing before the bars of her cell.
So, from the time you were 22 to 24.
She stood motionless except for the gradual turning of her head to level her sharp glare on him as he walked. Her fingers looked all the more delicate curled around the drab grey bars that imprisoned her. Vane-eyed Drace, but quickly turned back to the general.
So, Landis fell and you returned to Dalmasca. Right,
she confirmed with a nod.
Why fight for Landis in the first place, then? I went to live there when I married. Your husband is Landisian. Was. Apologies.
Noting that neither her gaze nor her tone faltered, he continued as steadily as he could.
So, at 24 you joined the old order and served under Captain Vossler, for 6 years, until I was 30. But you were never at Nalbina. I was injured before my troop departed. Bosch killed them all. I've always thought myself lucky.
At last he ceased his pacing, hoping with all earnestness that he had finally found a gap in her rehearsal.
Do you call all your superior officers by their first names?
He asked.
Do you still consider that traitor a superior officer?
She asked back.
Well, he certainly did me a great favor.
And at this she wrinkled her nose in disgust, eliciting a nearly imperceptible smirk on his part, though he managed to restrain himself with speed only possessed by one who had been trained in managing his manners since infancy.
You may be surprised to learn that I have a quite reliable contact in your insurgents. Resistance.
A subtle metallic creaking sounded as Drace shifted, but Vane paid it no heed, instead holding up Gabranth's letter and regarding the general with his best impression of his father.
Apparently, he's never heard of you. And yet you have,
she replied in that short, precise way that Dalmascans so often did.
Is this your idea of reliable?
His expression yielded to reflect his true emotions, but he continued to address her as he would a soldier.
Let's drop the pretenses, shall we? You never served Ronsenberg or Vossler, and you are certainly not 32. But Bosch? A friend of yours. A friend of my husband's,
she corrected, at last breaking eye contact. Vane smirked.
Who wasn't at all Landisian, right? Nabradian.
Her cold grey eyes returned upward and shimmered like fish scales.
And I'm 25. But you already knew that, didn't you? You're nothing without proof. I can take you to it. What?
He scoffed.
The treasury on the 3rd floor? Our little thief friends left it wide open last night.
She cocked her head.
That's what they were after. Apparently not.
He resumed his pacing.
It's not there and it wasn't on any of them. That's what you're after. You may recall, madam, that I am the one interrogating you. And I suppose that's about all you can do until you find the Dusk Shard. If you're lying. I'm not.
He halted, meeting her eyes once more, though he found himself unable to intimidate her in the least. Seeing no weakness in her resolve, he silently took his leave, and she, after momentarily resting her gaze on the door after it slammed and then on the judge who watched over her, strode elegantly back to the bench at the far end of her cell and sat, deep in thought and eager for the future. Back in the hall once more, Vane turned to his bodyguard.
Bergen. My lord. How close is the 8th? Docking in Bujerba as we speak. Perfect.
He crumpled the letter in his fist.
Send for the Shiva.